The fluorescent lights in that conference room were the kind that hum just loud enough to make you feel like your thoughts aren't your own. I remember staring at the water stain on the ceiling tile, oval-shaped, brownish at the edges, while my husband's attorney laid out what 43 years of my life was apparently worth. Not much, according to him. I was 64 years old, sitting in a beige chair that was slightly too low for the table, and I had the strangest thought. I used to know how to start an IV on a moving patient in a bouncing ambulance. I used to do that. My hands, folded in my lap, had once been the steadiest hands in the ER. But that was before. My name doesn't matter as much as my story does. What matters is that I was a registered nurse for 11 years, critical care, emergency department, the kind of work that makes you feel like your feet are planted somewhere important. I graduated from nursing school at 22 with a student loan, a used Honda, and the specific kind of confidence that comes from surviving something hard. I thought I was going to spend my whole life in medicine. I thought that was who I was. Then I met my husband at a friend's cookout in the summer of 1981. He was handsome in a way that photographs never quite captured. Tall, with the kind of easy laugh that made everyone in a room feel like they were the ones being clever. He sold commercial real estate and talked about the future like it was already built and waiting for us to walk in. On our third date, he told me I was the most capable woman he'd ever met. On our fifth, he said he'd never seen anyone who worked as hard as I did. I should have paid attention to what came next. We got married in October of 1982. I kept working for 2 more years. Then our son was born, and my husband sat me down one evening with a yellow legal pad. He always had a yellow legal pad, and explained very reasonably that the numbers didn't make sense. Childcare costs, my irregular shift hours, the stress on the family. He drew columns. He showed me the math. He said, I just want what's best for us. And at 26 years old, with a colicky infant and a husband who seemed to have thought everything through, I believed him. I handed in my notice 3 weeks later. I told myself it was temporary. Most women tell themselves that. Our daughter came 2 years after our son. The house got bigger. My husband's business expanded. We moved to a nicer neighborhood, joined a club, started taking vacations to places sound. From the outside, I imagine we looked like proof that the system works. Comfortable house, well-dressed children. A wife who was always available, always organized, always there. What you couldn't see from the outside. I hadn't had my own checking account since 1988. It happened so gradually, I couldn't point to the moment it began. First, it was just easier to have one account. His income went in, the household bills came out, and he handled the investments. Then he started mentioning gently that I'd never really understood finances the way he did. Not mean about it, just matter of fact. You focus on the house and the kids, I'll handle the money side. And I did. I trusted him, and I stopped asking questions, and somewhere along the way, not asking questions became the rule. By the time my children were in high school, I had to tell him what I needed before I went to the grocery store. He would transfer money into a small account, not my account, technically, an account with both our names but only his debit card, and I would buy exactly what was on the list. If I bought something that wasn't on the list, I heard about it, not screaming. He was never a screamer. It was quieter than that. A look at the receipt, a pause. We talked about the budget. That particular tone of patient disappointment that made me feel like a child who'd forgotten her homework. I stopped buying things that weren't on the list. I stopped painting too, eventually. I'd always painted watercolors, mostly nothing serious, but the supplies cost money, and there was always a reason it wasn't a good time. One year it was the roof. Another year it was our son's college expenses. The brushes dried up in the closet, and I didn't replace them, and one day I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd wanted to. That's what slow erosion looks like. You don't notice the riverbank disappearing until you're standing somewhere unfamiliar, wondering how you got here. Our children grew up and moved out. That was when things got quieter in ways that were harder to ignore. It was just the two of us in that big house, and my husband's patience, which had always had a slightly supervisory quality, started to feel like something else. Like I was an employee he was tolerating past her useful years. He criticized the way I loaded the dishwasher, the way I answered the phone when his colleagues called. He told me I'd let myself go, which was remarkable given that I'd spent 30 years making sure he had ironed shirts and dinner on the table by 6:30. He started taking trips for work that lasted longer than they used to. He came home with new opinions about things, restaurants, wines, what kind of people were worth knowing, that he'd gotten from somewhere that wasn't me. I'm not stupid. I knew what was happening. I just didn't know what to do about it. My daughter came to visit one weekend while he was away. We had lunch at a little place near my house. She'd found it, she has good instincts, and I watched her eat her salad and talk about her job and her apartment, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, something that might have been envy, except it was softer than that, more like grief. Mom, she said, setting down her fork. Are you okay? I said, of course. She didn't look convinced. She had a daughter of her own by then, my granddaughter, who was 13, a serious kid with her mother's good instincts and her own quiet intensity. My granddaughter had started calling me every Sunday. Not because her mother told her to, she'd just started doing it on her own. A few months before everything came apart, she'd ask me what I was reading, what I was cooking, whether I'd been outside that week. The kinds of questions my husband hadn't asked me in years. I didn't realize at the time that she was paying attention to much more than my answers. My husband filed for divorce on a Tuesday in February. I found out when the papers arrived at the house because he hadn't told me in advance. He'd already spoken to an attorney. He'd already made arrangements. He had a plan the way he always had a plan, and once again, I was the last to know. His attorney's position was simple. I hadn't worked in 38 years. I had no income, no professional credentials that were still current, no assets in my own name. The house was in both our names, but he intended to sell it. He was offering what he called a fair settlement, which was a number that would maybe cover 3 years of the way we'd been living, after which I was apparently expected to figure it out. I was 64 years old. My nursing license had lapsed 20 years ago. I had no savings that were mine. And my husband's attorney kept using the word fair as though repetition would eventually make it feel that way. My attorney, a small, precise woman with reading glasses she wore, pushed up on her head until she needed them, told me not to panic. We had a case. 38 years of marriage, documented financial dependence, a lifestyle that would need to be maintained. But she was also honest with me. These things take time, they're expensive, and my husband had a 30-year head start in terms of documentation. I went home to that house, his house, really. I understood that now, and I sat in the kitchen at the island where I'd made 10,000 breakfasts, and I tried to think of one decision I had made freely in the last 3 decades. It took me a long time to come up with more than a handful. The mediation meeting was set for March. A conference room on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a view of the city that neither of us looked at. My husband arrived with his attorney and a composed expression that told me he expected this to go a particular way. He'd always been good at expecting things to go a particular way, usually because he'd arranged them to. He looked surprised to see my granddaughter in the hallway outside. My daughter had brought her. I hadn't asked them to come. They'd come anyway, my daughter sitting in a chair against the wall with her coat still on, my granddaughter beside her with a backpack in her lap, and that careful, watchful expression she had when she was thinking hard about something. I hugged them both. I told my granddaughter she didn't need to be there, that this wasn't something a kid should have to sit through. She said, I know, Grandma, but I need to talk to the mediator first. I thought I'd misheard her. I looked at my daughter, who gave me a look I couldn't quite read, something between apology and resolution. She asked me if she could, my daughter said quietly. I said yes, I think you should let her. I didn't understand, but I nodded. What happened in that conference room in the next 20 minutes is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The mediator was a measured, experienced-looking man in his late 50s who had clearly seen a great many divorce proceedings. He regarded my granddaughter, 13 years old, backpack on her lap, with the kind of careful neutrality that good mediators have. My husband's attorney began to object almost immediately. This was irregular, the child had no legal standing, this was not appropriate. My granddaughter looked at the mediator and said, I have something I'd like you to hear before we start. It's a recording, and I think it's relevant to my grandmother's situation. My husband made a sound, not quite a word. What kind of recording? The mediator asked. A conversation, my granddaughter said, between my grandfather and my mother, from 6 weeks ago. My grandfather didn't know I was in the other room. I looked at my husband. For the first time in 43 years, I watched him not know what to do. I need to explain what happened 6 weeks earlier, because I only learned about it afterward. My husband had called my daughter. Their relationship had always been complicated, strained in ways I tried not to take sides in, and asked her to come to the house. He told her it was to discuss the divorce in a civilized way. What he actually did was spend 90 minutes trying to convince my daughter to persuade me to accept his settlement offer. He told her I was being unreasonable. He told her that I'd never really understood money. He used that word, understand, the same way he'd used it with me for decades, with that particular implication that some of us simply aren't equipped. He told my daughter that I should be grateful for what he was offering because a woman who hadn't worked in nearly 40 years couldn't honestly expect to maintain a lifestyle she hadn't contributed to. He said that. My daughter, to her credit, did not agree with him. But she didn't argue either because she knows her father, and she knows that arguing with him in that mode is like arguing with a wall that also grades you on your technique. What neither of them knew was that my granddaughter had come along for the drive and was sitting in the den with her headphones around her neck, allegedly doing homework, and that at some point she'd quietly opened a voice memo on her phone. She is 13. She is also apparently considerably wiser than most adults I know. In that conference room, the mediator listened to 3 minutes and 40 seconds of my husband's voice explaining, in his own calm and reasonable way, that I was financially dependent not because of any choices he had made, but because I had never been particularly motivated, that I had given up my nursing career willingly and enthusiastically, and that expecting him to support my lifestyle indefinitely was frankly not something the law should require. He said about me that women of my generation had made their choices and should live with them. He said about himself that he had worked very hard so that I could have a comfortable life and that my discomfort now was as the result of my own lack of planning. The mediator stopped the recording. He looked at my husband for a long moment. My husband's attorney was very still. I think, the mediator said, in the careful way of someone choosing every word, we may need to reframe some of the parameters of this discussion. I don't cry easily. I spent 11 years in emergency medicine. I have held the hands of strangers in terrible moments and kept my voice steady. But sitting in that chair, listening to my husband's voice saying the things he'd always only implied, laid out flat and recorded, permanent, undeniable, something in my chest just opened up and I couldn't do anything about it. My granddaughter reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. What followed was several weeks of negotiation that I will spare you in detail, except to say that the terms changed considerably. The house was to be sold and the proceeds split. My husband's pension, the one his attorney had initially argued was separate property, was placed in a different category once my own attorney introduced the concept that 38 years of unpaid household labor and career sacrifice had, in fact, been a material contribution to the financial stability that allowed that pension to exist. There was also the matter of spousal support, which was recalculated upward in a way that my husband did not like, and his attorney could no longer argue against with quite the same confidence. The recording was not technically introduced as legal evidence. What it did was shift the entire atmosphere of the negotiation. My husband knew what was on it, his attorney knew what was on it, and they both knew that whatever could be recorded once in a private house, in a conversation they hadn't expected to have witnessed, could perhaps be spoken about again in other contexts if this did not resolve in a reasonable way. My husband is a practical man. He calculated his options. He accepted a revised settlement. The day the paperwork was finalized, I went to my daughter's house for dinner. My granddaughter had made a cake, yellow, with white frosting, because it's the kind I like, and she'd remembered without being told. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us, with the cake and some bad sparkling wine, and the particular feeling that comes after a very long thing is finally fully over. I have to ask you something, I said to my granddaughter. She looked up. Did you know what you had when you made that recording? Did you understand what you were doing? She thought about it for a moment, the way she always thinks about things, genuinely, not performing consideration. I knew Grandpa was trying to get Mom to take his side, she said, and I knew that wasn't fair. So I thought, someone should remember exactly what he said. She shrugged a little. Adults forget things when it's convenient. 30 years of my life, summarized. I've been thinking a lot lately about the woman I was at 22. The one with the student loan and the used Honda and the steadiest hands in the room. I've been thinking about how she didn't disappear exactly. She just got very quiet. She got patient in ways that weren't good for her. She learned to need less, want less, ask for less, until she was so small inside her own life that she'd nearly forgotten what she'd been before she started shrinking. My nursing license is lapsed. That's true. I'm 64 years old and the medical field has changed in ways I'd have to work hard to catch up to. But here's what else is true. I still know how to learn things. I still know how to work hard. I spent 38 years managing a household, raising 2 children, hosting, organizing, budgeting, problem solving, doing approximately 10 different jobs simultaneously without compensation or acknowledgement. Those skills didn't evaporate. They just weren't on anyone's spreadsheet. I've started volunteering at a clinic 2 mornings a week. Not clinical work, I'm not licensed for that, but patient intake, resource navigation, helping people fill out forms in a system that's designed to confuse them. The nurses there are decades younger than me and occasionally look at me with polite uncertainty about what to do with a 64-year-old volunteer in reading glasses. Then they see me talk a frightened patient through a complicated insurance situation in 10 minutes flat, and the uncertainty tends to go away. I bought watercolor supplies last month. Good ones, not the cheap set I used to hide in the closet. I set them up on the kitchen table of my apartment. I have my own apartment now, the first place that's been only mine since a studio I rented in 1980, and I sat there for a long time before I started. Not because I didn't know what to paint. Because I'd forgotten what it felt like to be in a room full of things that were only mine, where nobody needed anything from me, where I could sit with a blank page and not have to explain myself. Then I picked up a brush and painted something small and imperfect and completely my own. My granddaughter came over last Sunday, the way she does every few weeks now. She brought her homework and she spread it out on my kitchen table, and I made us tea, and we worked on our separate things in a comfortable quiet that I am still, honestly, not entirely used to. Silence used to mean something was wrong. I'm learning that it doesn't have to. She looked up at one point and looked at the painting I'd hung above the sink, the first one, the imperfect one, and said, "I like that one." I said, "Thank you." She went back to her homework. I went back to my tea and the afternoon light coming through my own kitchen window and the very specific and very new sensation of a life that, at 64, I am only just beginning to arrange the way I want it. I'm not angry anymore. I was for a while. That's fair. But anger is expensive, and I have things I want to do with my energy now. Things I put away for so long I'd half convinced myself I'd never wanted them. I want to travel. I want to take a watercolor class with people who aren't going to look at me sideways for not knowing what I'm doing. I want to call my children when I want to, not because someone's schedule requires it. I want to sit in my own space on a Sunday morning with coffee and the newspaper and no one's opinion of my grocery choices. These are small things. I understand that they're small, but I gave them up once quietly, one at a time, without anyone asking if I was sure, and getting them back, this modestly, this late, this imperfectly, feels like something I don't have a word for yet. My granddaughter does, maybe. She's 13, and she already understands that some things need to be put on record before they disappear. I'm grateful someone in this family learned that lesson before I did.